Peace and freedom.
Peace. Hardly any other word is so misused, abused, misappropriated, and desecrated in our current times. Peace is a word that, when mentioned, should evoke good and positive thoughts, empathy and feelings of unison, tranquility, harmony, and togetherness. But instead, it is degraded to a meaningless and repetitive phrase, mainly by a large number of extremely irresponsible, criminal, and autocratic politicians, as well as by degenerate religious and sectarian leaders and unscrupulous dictators. The term peace is readily bandied about by human beings, but most of those who do so are unwilling or unable to even begin to understand the meaning of the word and recognize its value. The profound meaning that the word peace carries and the reverence, respect, harmony, and love that resonate in this term are completely unknown to those who cry out for revenge, war, terror, and retribution. The immeasurable energy that this word holds when it is not only spoken but also acted upon is evident in those societies that are free to develop and where life can evolve in a peaceful trajectory and prosperity is universal. The immense responsibility as well as the maturity and the necessary level of evolution of those life forms that not only misuse this term for their own interests, but also integrate it into their lives and also exemplify everything to their fellow human beings. Release forces that can pacify an entire planet. It is all the worse that a whole number of the so-called leaders, whether democratically elected or dictatorially self-appointed, whether politically, economically, or religiously conditioned, are incapable of bringing about, supporting and guaranteeing in a decent wise, with reason and understanding, a peaceful coexistence and a commonality of all earthly citizens, and this regardless of which ethnicity and religion the human beings feel connected to, which skin color they are, and which social class they belong to. This, even if it is a question of politicians, religious leaders, or dictators who are incapable of peace, who are megalomaniacs, who are obsessed with power, who are greedy for profit, who are arrogant, presumptuous, self-important, and who have gotten very badly out of control of the good nature as a human life form, etc., who only appear in a certain number because not all those in power belong to those out of control ones. The effects of inhumane politics, however, are more than catastrophic when measured against the whole of humanity and the whole planet. And all the bad excesses resulting from the effects of misguided politics and from the misguided work of religions, sects, and the misguided economy will continue to worsen in the worst manners in the future. The politicians, dictators, sect bosses, church leaders of all religions, and the terrorists of all shades of the current times have degraded the power and meaning of the word peace to a miserable phrase that is only associated with chaos, terror, torture, rape, destruction, and murder and manslaughter. It is they, the inhuman criminals and murderers, who have taken up residence in politics, religions, and sects, and are mainly responsible for the global chaos in which the human beings of the earth find themselves. The somewhat megalomaniac ideas and the personal worldview of politics, democracy and religion often lead them to impose their false and erroneous understanding of peace, freedom, love, and democracy on other human beings and cultures with violence and bloodshed. Equally extreme and irresponsible in the meantime, however, are also those political, economic, and religious, as well as sectarian and purely terrorist powers that make responsible and consistent action completely impossible because they have completely gotten out of control of their good human nature, or have become effeminate in their actions and deeds. In many cases, they are also subject to the misconception that everything must be discussed. On the contrary, consistent action and intervention is necessary to mitigate and possibly prevent even worse things. However, numerous compromises, especially in politics and religions, are an endless patchwork because they are not based on rationality and understanding, but on some political, economic, or religious dependencies that are useless as real solutions. As a result, political decisions, laws, etc., are constantly being changed and readjusted because they lack a reasonable foundation. The outcome, however, is always that the whole chaos and confusion of the citizens becomes even greater. This political inconsistency and the lack of responsibility of certain ineffectual state leaders can be seen in the disaster of Yugoslavia. Above all, the majority of European politicians totally failed there at the time and are still failing today. Because the irresponsible opinion prevailed, and continues to prevail, that everything will be all right again, and that everything will somehow be straightened out. This allowed the Yugoslav warlords to turn their country into a murderous and burning inferno. And during the bloody and murderous fighting, the torture and mass murder of large sections of certain population groups, the terror and the rapes, the EU politicians, in particular, never tired of mendaciously asserting that everything was on the way to a peace plan. In reality, however, the ground was soaked with human blood through the orgies of murder, torture and desecration, and through the violence, terror and hatred. The former multi-ethnic state was, so to speak, thrown back into the time of medieval conditions, and this in the so enlightened and seemingly democratic Europe of the 20th and 21st century. And the fact that NATO and its warriors also spread murder, death, fear, destruction, and terror is deliberately kept quiet. Religious conflicts that have existed for around 1800 years, centuries-old unpaid bills and hatred of nations were acted out by murdering thousands of human beings. European inconsistency and political effeminacy made the situation in the Balkans worse than before, during and after the actual war. Either the powers that be decide to intervene with all consequences and with courageous action, which may include appropriate and humanly responsible military intervention, or everything must remain as it is. But flimsy excuses must never be sought, just as nothing or only half-hearted action must not be taken. It is irrelevant as to which course is taken, because there must always be a humane, just implementation of necessary actions so that no murder and manslaughter, no torture, no rape, no destruction, and otherwise no loss of control of the good human nature come to light. And in this form alone is it humane to take consistent action in dignity, as well as in reverence for all life and human achievements. Actually, NATO and its affiliated states have no business in the Balkans. But NATO did not give a cold second thought and invaded the sovereign territory of the foreign state with vicious violence, depriving its people of the possibility to solve their own problems in a self-determining way. A nation can only rise to an era of peaceful coexistence and peaceful commonality through a process of internal development. But the European hysteria and the mendacious sense of responsibility of NATO and its affiliated states captivated everyone. This false sense of responsibility was repeatedly instilled in Europeans over a long period of time by all the media and by the politicians, which led many to fall into pro and hooray cheering when the NATO allies with their warriors attacked the foreign state and spread death and ruin and massive destruction. The same as it was practiced by the US and the British in Iraq to overthrow the bloody Saddam Hussein regime and to turn Iraq into a hopeless chaos. To which, however, it is to be added that the U.S. President George W. Bush, with the murderous and criminal machinations in Iraq, is much worse than Saddam Hussein was in his murderous heyday. Bush's war henchmen in Iraq are wild, degenerate beasts, as has often been the case in other wars under other American presidential warlords, and will also be the case in the future because the world remains silent about it. The old and new sham trials by military tribunals organized by the USA and the British against their military, torturers and rapists of both sexes, also do not contribute to the truth and to the mitigation of damage, or to the redress of all misery and evil, as well as of all distress, and to a revival of the murdered. And the fact that, when the crimes of torture become public knowledge, everything is denied and genuine, photographic evidence is described as forgeries, and the crimes are denied, is of course part of it, and is treated as a matter of course. Problems of the magnitude and conflict potential that existed and still exist in the First and Second World Wars, in Vietnam, in Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq can never be solved by such murderous, destructive, and criminal intervention from outside by foreign military and political powers, as was done by NATO, the US, and the British. Such chaotic regions and states can at best only be seemingly pacified by acts of war and occupying forces, and the reconstruction of everything destroyed costs countless billions and trillions. All those who have been cruelly tortured, humiliated, and violated can also not be healed of their psychological and mental as well as physical damage, just as it is impossible to bring those who have been cruelly and bestially murdered back to life. Troops can be stationed in the defeated countries and everything can be rebuilt, but this is only part of the work that must be done. However, all this will in no wise contribute to a more peaceful coexistence. The parties involved in the conflict must work out the solution to such a conflict for themselves. Any outside influence will bring even worse consequences for all involved in the long run. Warlike conflicts exist in many countries, including Sudan, where tens of thousands of innocent human beings are massacred and slaughtered, men, women, and children, with both regular militias and guerrilla fighters, etc., torturing and drowning in bloodlust. The perpetrators are states against states, but also members of different religious groups who slaughter each other for the sake of their faith. But this does not reach the general public because, on the one hand, it is not journalistically sensational enough, and also does not interest the readers much, and on the other hand, everything happens so far away that there is no direct connection to it. This is probably also true for Guantanamo Bay, where more than 600 military prisoners from various countries are being held and tortured by the U.S. military under inhumane conditions. This has long become the order of the day, and no one cares anymore. The world public is simply silent about it in order not to mess with the USA. What a bloody mess! The conflict in the Balkans is an ever-burning fire whose flames must be extinguished by the peoples concerned. They alone can contain it and extinguish it by means of rationality and intellect, but only by recognizing the futility of these many centuries-old feuds and useless religious disputes and blood feuds, etc. No external power can force or bring this peace. That is not possible. A human being, a community, a people must realize for themselves that a desired peace must be created and maintained through painstaking work, and this requires the rationality and will of each individual. However, as long as leaders who have gotten very badly out of control of their good human nature keep coming to power, bringing discord, hatred, and envy upon the human beings, and manipulating them into war, torture, rape of women, sexual abuse of children, and murder and manslaughter, as well as revenge, hatred, and retaliation through diatribes, cries for revenge. These out-of-control, irresponsible, and power-hungry, as well as autocratic and criminal creatures, will determine the fate of their respective countries and also that of other states. The religions, with all their confused and erroneous teachings, do the rest to fuel such conflicts and promote the wars and terror. The many different religions and their thousandfold sectarianism with their ausgearteten, having gotten very badly out of control of the good human-natured behaviors, and human being-dumbing heresies on our planet inevitably cause conflicts. Because the illogic behind all religions and sects and the irrationality of belief confuse the human beings more and more. This also contributes to the fact that it is not possible to find peaceful coexistence and a world-encompassing community. As long as there are religions and the resulting sects, wars and terror are inevitably pre-programmed. For this reason alone, it is so fundamentally important for the development of a nation that human beings recognize who is abusing them for their own ausgearteten, badly out of control of good human nature-based goals, or who is contributing to and capable of enabling a country to develop in peace and freedom. Especially at the present time, when the most dangerous hotbeds of strife, terror and torture, etc., in the former Yugoslavian countries as well as in Afghanistan and Iraq, along with many other centers of revolutionary and guerrilla warfare, as well as organized international terrorism, are making themselves heard in a terrible wise, there is more and more talk of peace again. This is happening not only in Switzerland and throughout Europe, but worldwide. But hatred and discord have poisoned the minds of human beings for generations, so that they no longer know what peace even means. Last but not least, the fact that the EU and NATO, together with their allies, were politically unable to prevent these warlike events before the outbreak of the Balkan War is also a contributing factor in the new era. This circumstance shows the helplessness, incapacity, and incompetence of the entire EU apparatus and all EU member states. Back then, before the fighting started in the Balkans, it was clear that there would be an internal military conflict of the worst magnitude. However, no one wanted to burn their fingers on it, and therefore also did not want to take the necessary steps through consistent political action. When it was finally decided much too late to take action, after there had already been tens of thousands of deaths, everything again happened only half-heartedly, and not with the necessary consistency. All sides involved should have been disarmed immediately, and those responsible should have been tried and sentenced immediately. Most of the responsible murderers, however, are still walking around free or performing their theater of innocence at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, making it completely untrustworthy and ridiculous, while U.S. America refuses to let its own war criminals be tried by the International Court. Years of dragging out trials against war criminals also show the complete helplessness of the International Court of Justice. And if a verdict is passed against thousands and thousands of mass murderers, then it corresponds to such a farce and effeminacy of the judges that the mass killers only grin and laugh, and in 15 or 20 years they will be unleashed on humankind again to commit new acts of shame and murder, instead of being segregated from society for life and being exiled for the rest of their lives. This effeminacy and typical political and judicial inconsistency of the people's leaders and judges, who only talk and are no longer capable of also acting within the necessary framework, shows how the human beings repeatedly withdraw from responsibility and have become incapable of recognizing, correctly assessing and judging a situation in order to then act fully consciously with the necessary logic. But this is also the fault of all those unfit psychiatrists who are incompetent loudmouths and grant every serious criminal indefinable extenuating circumstances for their despicable deeds, whereby they get off with lenient sentences and are let loose on humanity again after a short time. As a reasonable and responsible person, which national leader does one still believe that he or she stands for real peace, for which he or she verbally stands up in a responsible manner again and again for in the present time? If this were the case, as they want to make the citizens believe, then there would not be all the earthly conflicts that have been occurring on this planet for centuries. The peoples and religious leaders would have long since put this so important word into practice and ensured long overdue humane conditions on this planet if they had heeded their grandiloquent words themselves and put them into practice. Instead, however, the superiors, state powers and religious princes, as well as their henchmen, lie and deceive each other, just as they also lie to their own people, in such a human-despising kind and wise that it cries out to heaven and literally stinks. And all this only in order to shamefully swindle their own advantages with lies and deceit. They are only concerned with their own power, with their interests and profit, and with exercising their might over the people and the world. If they do not do this, they rest on the laurels of their country, which is in dubious peace, and in no wise take the necessary responsibility to really maintain peace in their own state, or also to ensure peace and harmony where there is murder and manslaughter. On the other hand, there are also such state powers and their stupid fellow followers who traitorously barter away the sovereignty of their homeland and destroy freedom by putting their own state under the thumb of a dubious sovereignty. Although the human beings within Europe are doing relatively well, the peaceful impression is very deceptive. The political repercussions, triggered by various countries and their leaders unable to contribute to global peace, are unmistakable. Numerous popular leaders are living out their entrusted position in a more degenerate and irresponsible wise. They spread hatred, discord, envy, and war, or they instigate other mischief. Their delusional and pathological thinking and actions only bring murder, death, suffering, and terror upon the citizens of the earth and upon the whole planet, which automatically affects all human beings in its consequences. It does not matter whether they live in a currently still reasonably peaceful Europe or elsewhere, because the effects of all military, terrorist, and religious, as well as sectarian events and their consequences sooner or later affect everyone without exception. It is an illusion to believe that just because the human beings have everything they want in terms of goods, etc., and there has been no war or other revolutionary unrest in most European countries for decades. The Europeans can shirk their global responsibility for world peace, and that this state of affairs will last. Everyone shares responsibility for putting the remaining warmongers and war agitators who are still up to their mischief and sometimes act as dubiously democratically elected popular leaders in their place in order to put an end to their activities. Peace includes, above all, the preparedness to engage in joint dialogue, combined with the realization on the part of the disputing parties that it is not possible without reasonable compromises and that each side must make concessions. Waging wars and murdering human beings for an allegedly humane or religious goal means nothing other than waging evil. Brutal and inhumane violence, mistreating, oppressing, raping, and massacring fellow human beings. For some criminals of humanity, however, this is child's play, which is true of both ausgeartete, those who have gotten very badly out of control of their good human nature, state powers, and their henchmen who torture, murder, rape, and ravish as secret service agents or military personnel. In fact, it only takes a few creatures who have ausgeartet in their political thinking and religious delusions to drive an entire nation into chaos and spread murder and terror in order to achieve their supposedly peaceful and noble goals. They could not care less that in the process they plunge countless peace-loving and innocent human beings, women, children, and men into misery, pain, and death. It is said again and again that wars are normal and a condition of human beings, and earthly history shows us that it is indeed so up to the present time with regard to this terrible normality. This does not mean, however, that Earth humans must automatically retain the aggressiveness that has accompanied them for millennia and is the main cause of the state of discord and lack of freedom, as well as indifference and unkindness towards fellow human beings. This in addition to religions, sects, and the bloodthirsty and power-hungry state powers and fanatical terrorists. All of this does not mean that all of the worldwide evil that has eaten into humanity must continue on. Peace is a good and inestimable value which Earth humans have to create and earn through painstaking work. But how things are on the Earth, at least at present, means a very hard struggle for every individual human being if he or she really wants to make an effort to create peace within himself or herself alone. Because this is necessary in order to also be able to make peace with their fellow human beings on the outside. Due to the aggressiveness of Earth humans and the historical events of wars and terror on our home planet Earth, all human beings must in future direct their attention towards getting along peacefully with each other. Peace can never be imposed from outside, and certainly not enforced by war, terror, and other means of violence. This is never possible. On the contrary, any form of trying to create peace through violence or to champion a cause through terrorist attacks automatically triggers further violence and conflict, but never a peaceful disposition or a free-minded direction. Real peace means first and foremost that every human being is so far in tune with his or her thoughts, feelings, and actions that they realize that no problems can be solved by violence and coercion, but that only new ones are ever created. This realization must urgently mature in the human beings of the earth, and it must be carried outwards and exemplified to the fellow human beings. If this state is exemplified, then sooner or later other human beings will more or less automatically align themselves with it, because they recognize in their consciousness that it is something valuable. In this wise, this realization can be transferred to others only sporadically and slowly at first, but over time, like an avalanche, when they become willing and able to recognize the whole of what is valuable. Of course, there will always be human beings who come to this realization only very slowly or even refuse to do so and think they can take the path of violence. But sooner or later, they too will be taught better by the majority of those who strive for real peace, and will also have to come to terms with it. There is no reason for resignation, and also no reason to bury one's head in the sand. Even in this day and age, when everything seems to be coming apart at the seams, and human lives are no longer worth anything. No, rather, the human being who spends his or her life in a decent manner must also continue to do so. He or she should not and must not get angry about the cheats, murderers, and other degenerate ones who have gotten very badly out of control of their good human nature and who increasingly cause chaos, hatred, envy, and discord. Rather, they should and must also continue to align themselves with the basic values of life: harmony and truthfulness, reverence and love, which are necessary as the foundation of existence to carry everything for the better over the years, decades, and centuries. Each individual must help and take responsibility to give new impetus and depth and strength to the meaning of the word and value peace. In concrete terms, peace also means a condition that must be brought about through which it is possible for all social strata and the human beings that compose them to provide a basis from which all can develop and evolve. At all times, the people and thus every single individual must recognize with rationality and intellect, and thus through an inner process of learning and maturing, and orient their consciousness towards the fact that only true peace also actually means evolution, and that war, terror, destruction, delusion, fanaticism, and degeneration only bring about devolution and disaster. Inner realization and the associated learning process are the basis for a common togetherness and a truly functioning human community in peace, freedom, love, and harmony. Science, technology, quality of life, etc., can develop and spread to an undreamt of extent in times of peace, opening up tremendous prospects for the future, which begin to be created in all human beings, as if of their own accord, and bring about desirable progress. If negative factors arise in the affluent society, such as disintegration of society, growing crime, etc., this can be counteracted, and this process stopped by the human being living his or her life in a conscious manner, recognizing their strengths and weaknesses, and consciously working on himself or herself as a human life form to improve themselves in every direction. Peace is the guarantor of prosperity, further development, and evolution. War and terror, etc., are the allies of destruction and degeneration. Just as anger, hatred, and jealousy can never bring about anything positive or good in human beings, neither is it possible with Gewalt, terror, and wars. No society and no individual can develop further through destruction and war. Just as interpersonal forms of conflict resolution that originate from behavior that is badly out of control of the good human nature can never bring about anything positive. One's own point of view and one's own interests must not be the focus of one's way of looking at life, but fellow human beings and their interests and needs, as well as peace, freedom, love, and harmony, must also be included in one's considerations, and thus in one's thoughts and feelings. In order to be able to incorporate equality into one's decisions. To start only from one's own point of view is very narrow-minded and will never lead to real success and not to true peace. If a human being is only concerned with his or her own advantage, without taking into account the interests of their fellow human beings, then neither peace nor love, freedom and harmony can come about. It is necessary to take into account the nuances of all the parties involved. Anything else will not last. The millions of victims caused by political and religious fanaticism, as well as degenerated historical knowledge, due to which the different sides see themselves in the historical right and lay claim to a country or a region, and this at the expense of all those humans who are covered with murder. Terror and anarchy by this unreasonable action show the madness of such thoughts, feelings, and actions. Except for the politicians and their hawks who support the terrorist policy, who see themselves in the right and want to emerge as winners from their so-called peace negotiations, there are only losers on both sides. Worse still, wars and conflicts cannot be limited to the regions concerned, for rather, whether directly or indirectly, they also have an impact on all other states and human beings who are not directly involved. The responsible politicians and leaders have still not understood to this day what they are doing with their policy of destruction and mass murder. They are incapable of taking and bearing responsibility over other human beings, let alone countries. Two of these inhuman and criminal groups have been at war with each other for decades and shun any means to lead their two peoples into a peaceful era. The justifications pulled out of their fingers, based on false historical assumptions, are reason enough for all sides to act out their conflicts with destruction. Rape, torture, murder, and manslaughter, to terrorize each other and to use every possible means to prevent peace and fuel hatred. It is also the Israeli government, with its criminal and human-despising, as well as degenerate politicians and criminal hawks, whose warmongering policies make coexistence between them and the Palestinians impossible. But it is also those Palestinian terrorists and officially recognized political groups with their murdering henchmen, whose real interest is the never-ending and eternal struggle against the Israelis. Both sides have become so very badly out of control of the good human nature, degenerate and primitive in their thinking, that they are no longer capable of looking for and also finding a solution. A solution that does justice to the human beings for whom they are responsible, and that guarantees a lasting peace. They do not want it at all. Yet they never tire of their mendacious assertions for a peace process. While somewhere else in the region, innocent Israelis are being blown up by a bomb, or Palestinians are being shot and murdered by Israeli occupation forces. Above all, the two power-obsessed leaders, Ariel Sharon and Yasser Arafat, contribute with their irresponsible actions and deeds to the fact that the concept of peace has degenerated into a triviality. Again and again, these two creatures, who have gotten very badly out of control of their good human natures, talk about peace negotiations, peace plans, a way to peace, peace talks, roadmaps, etc. But they are not even able to face each other for reconciliatory conversations with honest and peaceful intentions. Their policy of terror, destruction, annihilation of human lives, and disregard for all values which constitute human togetherness, among others, has made them servants of terror and megalomania. The historical and human fanaticism emanating from these two sad political figures, the hatred and discord spread by both of them, makes them, with their approach and the resulting consequences, the best example of how bad things really are for global peace and for the true humanity of many Earth humans. On both sides, there are enough rational ones and human beings powerful of intellect who have recognized that there can only be a common future through peace. A large part of the population on both sides wants peace and is ready for compromise. The warmongers and war agitators, however, all the fools and degenerate minds who think they can achieve peace through terror, truly prevent any peace process and nip any such beginning in the bud again and again. These eternally outdated and creatures who have gotten very badly out of control of their good human natures do not even know what they are doing to the human beings of their region, just as they do not know what mischief they are bringing upon the whole of earthly humanity, and what they are doing with their hatred, envy, terror, and eternal conflict. As long as these two sides are so destructively opposed to each other, there will never be global peace on the planet Earth. Both sides, as well as the UN, which allows itself to be seduced by those out-of-control ones, are challenged to find new and truly honest, peaceful ways to secure the continued existence of the Earth humans with true peace. Should a global military conflict occur, that is to say, a Third World War, triggered above all by the destructive machinations of the U.S. administration and its accomplices, then one may assume that it will find its origin in the Middle East. Politicians on both sides who are mainly responsible for this state of affairs should be deposed for their criminal actions and excluded from society for life, to be held accountable for the rest of their lives for their pathological, high-handed, and megalomaniac actions. Much worse are the actions of the various U.S. administrations, which are mainly responsible for their policy of constant interference in the affairs of other countries. Also monstrous are the inhuman massacres and tortures, and all the shameful sexual degenerations perpetrated by conscienceless and degenerate elements of the U.S. armed forces on their prisoners, not only in Iraq and Afghanistan, but wherever U.S. warriors ply their shameful and bloody trade. But this is not only common in some elements of the U.S. armed forces today. It has been so since time immemorial, starting with the Indians, who were massacred, sexually violated, and tortured to death by many U.S. citizens and the U.S. military, and ending with the Vietnam War. One only has to think of the My Lai massacre and all the other Ausartungen acts brought about from having gotten very badly out of control of one's good human nature by members of the U.S. Army. The same applies to the numerous global conflicts and the USA's decisive culpability in an impending Third World conflagration, which will dwarf all previous wars in its effects if it should actually occur, if the people themselves do not become clever and responsible enough to depose the criminal state powers and their fellow howlers and send them, along with their supporters from among the people, into a lifetime of exile. The intrigues and the power politics of the U.S. administration, especially in the last decades, and its policies, in which only the interests of the USA were and are in the foreground, at the expense of all other human beings and countries in the whole world, and in disregard of all human rights and human duties, as well as human dignity, have caused serious damage to the whole of humanity and the planet. U.S. America is a country that will not be able and willing to pacify the planet Earth until far into the future. Because the necessary sense of responsibility is completely lacking, and because U.S. America wants to unconscionably grab the whole planet with all its resources. The fact that half the world will be destroyed in the process, and millions of human lives will be wiped out is of no consequence to those criminally responsible, nor to the simple-minded followers from the people, whose sense of responsibility is also not worth a dime. U.S. America may be militarily, technologically, and economically on top, but it is morally, ethically, and interpersonally or behind the basic values and ideals of a third world country. A large part of the U.S. Americans, the broad masses, are easily influenced and manipulated because their consciousness is only focused on power, money, and consumption. Human elementary basic values, however, are completely missing. Although the country has managed to play itself up as the world's policeman, and to give the impression of standing up for the most diverse basic democratic values, combined with a dubious democracy, mendacious freedom and hypocritical roars of peace, appearances are deceptive and stink to high heaven. The interests of other countries must always give way to American interests, whereby any evil and ausgeartet means of cruel gibet, beyond all might and violence, with all available forceful means, physical, psychical, mental, and to use consciousness-based powers, abilities, and skills in order to carry out and practice tremendous deeds and actions, is just good enough to enforce them. The USA instigates wars, supports dictatorships, and plays the most diverse governments and human beings against each other in order to achieve its own goal and realize its own interests. Every means is used to foment hatred, discord, and envy in the world, and to promote dictators when it is conducive to its own political economic goals. These are facts and political realities that have nothing to do with anti-Americanism if they are pointed out with hard and clear words. And indeed they can be observed on a daily basis. The mendacity, self-importance, and obsession with power, which are willingly implemented all over the world by dictatorial means, terror, and violence, make the USA a country from which Europe should break away as soon as possible. This disengagement is absolutely necessary because the political and economic interests of the USA are far from also taking into account the interests of the others and recognizing them as equal partners. However, for a global community to be possible, all participants must be equal. However, the form of thinking and acting that can be experienced time and again in U.S. politics does not allow for this. The USA sees itself as something better and superior to all other states and human beings in the world and glorifies itself. This manner of looking at things makes it almost impossible for those decent U.S. Americans who have recognized the truth to raise their voices in the sea of patriotism and egoism that has accompanied this country since its foundation and to counteract it. But how could it be otherwise than that? A certain number of distant descendants of the former emigrants from Europe have become no different and no better than all the criminals and sectarians who fled from Europe to the land of opportunity, early America, or were driven to flee by the authorities. The manipulability of willing U.S. citizens, the false friendship behavior, and the completely false and ausgeartet patriotism of so many U.S. Americans, who have lost or never learned their view for the truth and reality of life and cloud all their thoughts and feelings even with lies and deceit, correspond to the U.S. bourgeois superficiality. And those U.S. citizens who are counted among them, together with the U.S. government and the U.S. Secret Services and the U.S. Armed Forces, are a threat to the planet Earth and all of earthly humanity. The overall result of U.S. foreign policy is a never-ending disaster of terror, destruction, manipulation, intelligence machinations, and intrigues that are destabilizing the world more and more. This will also increase considerably in the future, with dire consequences for all humanity. Unfortunately, the minority of U.S. citizens who refuse to accept and are ashamed of all the criminal and irresponsible as well as inhumane machinations of the Ausgearteten of U.S. America will not be able to change anything about all the evil unless the great mass of American citizens finally changes for the better. U.S. America does not have the right to have weapons that it denies to others. It does not have the right, for whatever reasons and motives, to invade other countries with war and terror in the name of democracy, freedom, peace, love, harmony, God's mission, and the fight against terrorism, etc. It does not have the right to be a military power. It does not have the right to act as a standard-bearer of values, world police, and megalomaniac superpower in order to impose its completely degenerated value and life standards on others. As long as the USA continues on this path, there can never be lasting and real peace and effective freedom. The world community is called upon to finally take the necessary steps to put the USA in its place and oppose it. At the same time, the USA's political, military, intelligence, economic, and sectarian forces must withdraw from all countries of Earth. It goes without saying that they must also never again interfere in the internal affairs of foreign states. The U.S. policy of being a great might must be curbed as soon as possible. Otherwise, among other evils, global and organized terrorism will never come to an end and will worsen many times over what has occurred worldwide in the near past and continues to occur at present. For centuries, probably since the existence of human beings, various cliques, megalomaniac and popular and religious leaders, who have gotten very badly out of the control of their good human natures, whether under democratic, dictatorial, or religious regimes, have been and continue to be responsible for the deaths of millions of human beings through their lies, power interests, and pathological thinking. Since time immemorial, autocratic and conscienceless state powers have been inciting their own people against others for their own personal interests with mendacious promises, false allegations, intrigues, and lies. A large part of the audience is hypnotically influenced by the frenzy of hatred, revenge, retaliation, and the war cries of the state powers and other warmongering creatures, without themselves thinking about the facts and reconsidering the megalomania of their leaders. Those who recognize the truth are always in such a minority that their cries are no longer heard amongst the war cries or are simply overruled. It is easy for state powers and terrorist rabble to squander vast amounts of money on war and terrorist acts, but it is very tedious and laborious for the tax-paying citizens to earn it. It is also easy for suggestive and irresponsible creatures to manipulate unstable human beings who, as the manipulated, are incapable in their simple-mindedness and low intelligence of thinking about the real facts. In their dog-like humility, they crawl behind the lying seducers and allow themselves to be beguiled by their stinking winds. It is easier to lick the boots of criminal creatures than to polish one's own to a shine, so as to be able to walk cleanly. And it is easier to start a war than to do everything to prevent one, and to look for compromises in order to achieve true peace. In the same manner, it is always easier to destroy everything by force of arms, and to destroy human lives, than to show and maintain the necessary respect and reverence for human beings. Earth humans wage war in the name of peace and freedom. And after all the millennia that have passed and been filled with war, as the earthly history of humankind proves, it has still not been realized that war and terror can never bring peace and freedom, just as love and harmony cannot. Every nation should immediately depose its leaders who drag other countries into war, no matter how plausible the justifications may seem, and exclude them from society forever, without the possibility that they can ever return to it. Bush and Co., Blair, Sharon, Arafat, Hussein and all the Ausgartete, those who are badly out of control of their good human natures, human creatures whose names are and will be in the future, who are responsible for quarrels, war and terror, should be banished so that humanity can finally work out and find real peace and freedom on its planet. However, as long as the people of all nations allow these megalomaniac, power-obsessed mass murderers to rule, there will be discord and wars, and the human beings will move further and further away from a peaceful community. Only if the human beings of the earth free themselves from these warmongers and unpeacemongers, who still want to force the solution of all problems with the help of violence and thus cause more and more chaos in the world, can a global peace process be initiated. However, such an initiation presupposes that every human being, first and foremost, deals with himself or herself, and no longer allows his or her life to be determined and imposed upon by the authorities, but is also prepared to take on the necessary responsibility so that peaceful coexistence becomes possible at all. Every individual is called upon as a human being, regardless of whether he or she lives in Europe, the Middle East, the USA, or anywhere else in the world. Real peace can only be achieved through human beings recognizing and learning that they create peace within themselves through their thoughts and feelings, through respect, reverence, and dignity, as well as through tolerance, and then exemplify it to their fellow human beings in order to serve as an example by which others can align and uplift themselves. Peace, then, must be worked out through an inner process and ultimately put into practice. The confused religious fanatics, with their badly out of control of their good human nature-based thinking, all religionists, all megalomaniac and irresponsible politicians and dictators, must be replaced by humans who know what responsibility the human being has to bear and fulfill towards human beings. Not religions, not politics, and certainly not the military, and not the secret services, nor sects will contribute anything good and positive to this process. It is the individual human being who must bring about the desire for peace within himself or herself, and make it a conscious part of his or her life. Only through this conscious process, through the willingness to do something for peace and not to let it degrade further to a trivial phrase, is it possible in its basic features that one day all human beings will fit into a peaceful and worldwide community. The hatred of human beings, whether in Yugoslavia or in the Middle East, is not to be defeated by sending out war troops for eventual pacification, or by erecting fences and borders for security. Hate can only be defeated when human beings are willing to let go of the evil past and deal with the present and a better future. However, it is possible to learn from the mistakes of the past and to integrate the knowledge gained from them into the present and the future. But what has already happened cannot be changed and cannot be undone. For this reason alone, it is nonsensical nonsense and, moreover, pathologically stupid to poke forever at past crimes and at the human degenerations that have taken place, such as past wars, dictatorships, destruction, torture, and atrocities of all kinds, etc., with the mendacious intention of supposedly coming to terms with the past. But it does not work like that, because the truth is that on the one hand, such insane actions evoke new hatred and a desire for revenge over and over again, and on the other hand, this nonsense creates evil remorse and feelings of guilt in the uninvolved and innocent descendants of those who were once wrong, which can even lead to madness. In fact, the descendants of the wrongdoers are innocent and must not be held accountable in any wise for deeds they did not commit themselves. Of course, atrocities of the past and thus historical events must not be forgotten, but they belong to the past and must not be carried into the future by acts of remembrance, cult rituals, and the like, as is done by Earth humans in the form of memorial days and commemorative rituals, etc., through which all the atrocious past is repeatedly recalled and heated up. On the one hand, this creates hatred, thoughts of revenge, and also feelings of guilt. And on the other hand, it encourages the misguided to act in the same wise as the wrongdoers of the past did. Evil events, atrocities and violent crimes, inhumanities, and other Ausartungen, the getting very badly out of control of the good human nature of any kind, are always only a small part of the entire history of a human being, a people, or a country. But to make them present again and again through commemorations and the like only has the effect of developing, in many human beings, a guilty conscience as well as feelings of shame and guilt or hatred and anger or imitation of the atrocities, which is in no wise conducive but absolutely obstructive to the development of all human beings affected by them. It is not a matter of denying the past or forgetting it, but only of looking forward and into the future. This, however, will never be possible by constantly looking back and digging around in the past. Because by forever reaching back into the atrocities, crimes, and inhumanities of the past, not only thoughts and feelings of guilt arise, but also, as I said, anger and hatred, as well as wild emotions that lead to destruction, murder, and manslaughter. And by clinging eternally to the ghastly past, the human beings of the earth come no closer to an inner and personal as well as global peace. The fact that human beings hold the horrid historical wars and annihilations of the past against each other and rehash the old atrocity stories again and again is obviously something they cannot recognize. Nor that human beings actually only have a future if they necessarily look forward and into the future. But it is precisely here that the question arises as to how long the dim-wittedness and low intelligence of those will last who keep reheating the long-past atrocities of the destroyers, the irresponsible, the killers, criminals, and mass murderers of state and dictatorial, as well as religious, fanatical, and terrorist might, by commemorating them in order to conjure up new, evil, terrible things. Europe in particular would have the potential to give a new meaning and dimension to global peace. Unfortunately, however, this fails because of individual political scatterbrains who put the interests of their country above those of others. They are of the opinion that for religious and historical reasons, or because of country-related quarrels, which they often start themselves, they only have to put their own interests first. These political as well as religious unteachable fools and egoists, these diehards who often bring God into play for their actions and swear by Him, which they also do on their national constitution, have learned nothing from the inhumane history to this day. As has been the case since time immemorial, such political figures reside in all governments within Europe and make it impossible for all to grow together as human beings into a common force and a peaceful community. In Europe, the states all only want to profit from their accession to the EU or from their membership, but they are in no wise prepared to also give something in return. Such parasites have no place in the community of the EU, which is in itself dubious and dictatorial, casting its nets in the same framework of power as almost all state powers do. All European states must make a choice. Either they represent the interests and membership of the European Union and belong to it, or they are boycotted from all sides. On the other hand, however, the European states turn themselves into followers of American policy and join in where state-sponsored global terror is carried out. This form has also already spread to NATO, which allows the military forces of its member states to go to war, where evil violence is then spread. But all this is not possible, even if human beings tend to always want to have everything. It is high time that Europe takes on the necessary responsibility and finally builds up a necessary antithesis to the USA and makes itself completely independent of this morally inhumane and, through the U.S. administration's, eternally warmongering and constantly causing global strife. This fact would also be a concern of the EU, which would have to oppose the warlike machinations and world domination efforts of the USA. But what are the responsible EU states and their fellow whiners doing instead? They send their military forces to help the U.S. troops who are waging war in foreign countries. Of course, in the sense of the lie told by the U.S. leaders and pro- and hurrah criers that everything serves peace and freedom as well as the international fight against terror. The fact, however, that the worst terror, as well as torture, murder, and manslaughter are being carried out by the alleged terror fighters is being deliberately concealed. It is time for Europe to build its own European military alliance, and to do so within a framework from which real peace and freedom can emerge. But this means that Europe must free itself from the burdens of NATO, in which the Americans are always in supreme command. It is Europe's obligation and task to promote peace and freedom in the world, and to carry both out into the world. But this can never happen within the framework of an EU as it exists today and harasses the citizens of all its member states with crazy laws, bans and regulations, etc., and with horrendous financial contributions to the EU itself. But it can also not happen as long as Europe does not break away from the USA. In fact, Earth's humanity is now living in a very seminal era in which it has become more aware of many things. Many no longer allow themselves to be led around by the nose by the fallible superiors, the state powers, but have taken responsibility because they have created their own view of the world and their own overview, in a wise that brings all self-responsibility to bear and demands that everything possible must finally be done for the future, for true peace, and for the effective freedom of all human beings. This should make it more difficult for all warmongers and war agitators to gain a foothold. And just as most of Europe is currently free of war, so it should also be everywhere in the world. Most warlike conflicts still take place outside Europe, but this can change quickly if the EU states continue to help the USA with military forces that are sent to the trouble spots where the Americans act in a warlike terrorist manner. The evolutionary stage of a certain sensible part of the population, which is still predominant in Europe, is already managing, even if only in the first outlines, to finally create the conditions for a possible peace and for real freedom, as well as to put the religions, by turning away from them, and the main perpetrators of numerous earthly conflicts in their place. However, it is still a minority which does not yet have great power. But if this minority grows, then one day there will be no more criminal state powers and no more religionists by whom the human beings are harassed, driven to death and into misery and distress. In the present age, thanks to numerous scientific discoveries, it is finally possible to define and recognize the interrelationships of life in many details and to tread the path of evolution and the path to peace and freedom with rationality and intellect and with the necessary reflection on the true laws of life. As an inhabitant of our home planet Earth, as a human being who has been observing the most diverse global conflicts from a safe Europe from the outside for decades, it is a tragedy to have to witness how human beings fight, massacre, hate, and ostracize each other on the basis of some false historical grounds, not infrequently as a result of lying stories based on a book called the Bible, which is, in any case, completely falsified and only a fictitious Jewish chronicle, and on other religious foundations of various kinds. Witnessing how individual dictators and democratically elected politicians and state powers are responsible for the deaths of millions of human beings, even today, is unfortunately still part of the daily routine. They are all supposedly interested in peace and freedom. However, it is not the state powers that be, but above all, a large part of the population that is really honestly calling for peace, because what honest and reasonable human being with a normal mind and sound reason is interested in the murder of other human beings and in terror? However, certain irresponsible, arrogant, self-important, and criminal people's leaders do not allow true peace and real freedom because they are obsessed with their might. As human beings, each individual is called upon to muster the necessary courage and develop the necessary responsibility, as well as a clear consciousness, to strive for a truly global peace as well as real freedom. This cannot be done through politics and religions, etc., but simply through the personal efforts of each human being himself or herself. Thus, every human being who is aware of his or her responsibility is called upon to take up the struggle for peace and freedom in order for the betterment of the world and to create a future in which love and harmony reign among human beings. Concept: Günter Neugebauer, February 2004. Elaboration: Billy.